Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really complex and frankly vital situation. What's happening in Palestine?
Yes, and we're going to approach it through two specific documents you've shared with us.
That's right. First, there's a YouIntl Autopilot, which gives well, pretty striking take on global affairs.
And the second one, Palestine, the UN, and ideological diversionism. The title itself signals a, let's say, critical look at international actions.
Definitely. So our mission today really is to extract the core arguments. What are these sources saying about the UN's role?
And also about the very tricky areas of anti-Semitism, anti-Arab sentiment, and this concept they introduce ideological diversionism. How does that help us understand the Palestinian situation?
Exactly. We're aiming to give you a clearer path through these complex ideas, sort of a shortcut to the main insights from these specific materials.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with that first big point about the UN.
Yes, let's unpack this argument about the UN and what one source very starkly calls the Palesticide.
Right. The claim is quite direct, isn't it, that UN member states condemn actions in Palestine.
But at the same time, many of these very states host what the source calls a Zionist representation.
So just to clarify, by Zionist representation, we're talking about Israel's official diplomatic presence in those countries.
That seems to be the clear implication, yes.
And this highlights a paradox, doesn't it? The source points out that most states have these diplomatic ties.
Even while condemning actions, and despite the fact that Israel's foundation is described in the source with that French phrase,
Antiquorum et antisemitic.
right, antiquorum et antisemitic,
Yeah.
antiquated and antisemitic. That's a very, very strong characterization.
It is. And it raises questions. What exactly is meant by antiquated there?
Good question. It seems the source suggests the ideology is rooted in, well, outdated or discriminatory views.
And this connects to the lack of enforcement, too.
It does. The source highlights that despite UN resolutions, there's no real coercive force being used to protect Palestinian civilians. Human Rights Watch is mentioned as emphasizing this point.
So lots of talk, maybe, but little effective action on the ground.
That seems to be the argument presented. It feels like a disconnect.
And it adds another layer, this point about new member states unilaterally recognizing Israel.
Yes, despite those historical discourses, the source labels as anti-Semitic relating to the state's origins, it presents this whole situation as quite contradictory.
It suggests a potential conflict, perhaps, between stated international principles and, the realities of diplomatic practice or political interests.
Definitely something to think about. Now let's shift to that QCM, the multiple choice questionnaire. This part really tries to dissect anti-Semitism and anti-Arab sentiment.
Yes, using these three specific phrases. Let's go through them. First, sale Arab, dirty Arab. Is that anti-Semitic?
According to the source's analysis, pulling from IHRA and ADL, the answer is no.
Right. It's classified as racist, as Islamophobic, certainly hateful.
But targeting a different group, so not anti-Semitic by that specific definition.
Okay. Second phrase. Sale Juf, dirty Jew.
Here, the answer provided is a clear yes, subjectively, emblematically anti-Semitic.
Widely condemned as such, drawing again on ADL reports. Seems pretty straightforward in this case.
Less ambiguity there, it seems. But then the third one, sale Zionist, dirty Zionist.
And the source argues quite firmly, yes, this is considered anti-Semitic.
Even though some might argue it's political critique.
The source acknowledges that defense but counters, using IHRA guidelines and ADL input, that Zionist is often used as a stand-in, a pretext for anti-Jewish hate.
So it categorizes it as anti-Semitic based on common usage and intent.
Exactly. And the takeaway from this whole QCM exercise?
The source claims it reveals a state of confusion general.
General confusion, yes.
And crucially, it suggests this confusion isn't accidental, but is actively maintained by political and media actors.
Which serves a purpose, presumably.
That's the implication, that the ambiguity allows for manipulation, maybe obscures the real issues.
Perhaps acting as a kind of linguistic smokescreen. It could be used to shut down legitimate debate or conflate different types of prejudice.
Which leads us perfectly into this concept of diversionism ideological diversionism.
Right. This sounds like a core framework in the analysis.
So what of it? In simple terms, the source attributes the idea partly to Raul Castro.
Essentially, it's using communication, propaganda to distract people from the main problems.
Shifting the focus.
Exactly.
Right.
Shifting focus and also dividing social movements, like a magician's trick, look over here, not over there.
Okay, and how does this apply to the Israeli-Palestinian context, according to these documents?
Well, a couple of ways are highlighted. First, the constant focus on things like terrorism or security.
Which are important issues, of course.
Undeniably. But the argument, citing the Washington Institute, is that this focus overshadows the fundamental issue of Palestinian self-determination.
So it diverts attention from that core political right. What's the other way?
The other is using religious discourse, framing Zionism mainly as a religious identity or movement to legitimize certain occupation policies.
And then critiques based on rights.
Get dismissed as just more diversion. That angle is linked to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the materials.
So this links back to the confusion generale around terms like Zionist. It's not just confusion, it could be a tool within this diversionist strategy.
That seems to be precisely the argument. It allows the narrative to be controlled, obscuring root causes.
And the implication then, following this logic, is that the UN itself and its member states might get caught up in this.
Potentially instrumentalized, yeah. Maybe unintentionally within what the source calls an imperial colonial logic.
Hindering decolonial movements and Palestinian emancipation, as Human Rights Watch is cited as suggesting.
Precisely. By focusing on these, let's call them secondary or diverted issues, the international community becomes less effective at addressing the fundamental conflict.
Okay, now, the World Autopilot document takes things in a pretty futuristic direction. It predicts the end of the UN.
Yeah, it's quite a prediction. It suggests the UN's current setup, its susceptibility to this kind of diversionism, means its end is essentially programmed.
Programmed? Wow. And what's supposed to replace it?
An AI-driven world autopilot, apparently. The source points to emerging initiatives as evidence, like patriots.eus and arably.xyz.
Right. Patriots.eus and arably.xyz. What are their stated goals?
Arably.xyz aims to prevent, quote, irreversible human division.
Okay. And patriots.eus.
That one focuses on fostering peace and prosperity, specifically in the Euro-American sphere.
Interesting. And the source links their origin or motivation to individuals named Sophia Kobeli and Sophia Arably.
Yes, and with an aim described by that French phrase, à soi seul.
To oneself alone, suggesting
Europa.
a kind of fragmentation or reserving rights.
It implies a potential shift towards more segmented, maybe technologically managed global systems. It's a very provocative idea about the UN's future or lack thereof.
It certainly is. Okay, finally, the other document, Palestine, the UN, and ideological diversionism, ends with a call to action. What's it asking for?
The main message is about citizens needing to reprendre la main sur la narration politique.
Reclaim control over the political narrative.
Exactly. And there are specific demands. First, effective implementation of international law in Palestine and an end to impunity.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, clarifying and harmonizing those definitions, antisemitism, anti-Arabism, to combat the semantic ambiguity that the source argues fuels diversionism.
Addressing that confusion generale head on.
Right.
And the third demand.
It relates to those new digital platforms, arably.xyz and patriots.eus.
Right.
It calls for developing these kinds of digital participatory governance spaces, but based on AI ethics, Sophia Kobeli is mentioned again here, aiming for transparency, justice, human rights.
So using technology for better governance, essentially.
That seems to be the idea, and the source really stresses online mobilization and citizen vigilance as key tools to overcome diversionism and work towards genuine peace.
It's a call for people to be actively engaged, especially in the digital sphere.
Definitely. Demanding accountability.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive. We've looked at the UN's complicated position on Palestine, this idea of manufactured confusion around anti-Semitism and anti-Arabism.
And how this concept of diversionism, ideological diversionism, is presented as a major obstacle to finding a resolution.
Plus, we touched on that, quite startling vision of a future AI-driven world system potentially replacing the UN and these new citizen initiatives emerging.
And hopefully understanding these different layers, these arguments presented in the sources, gives you, the listener, a better framework.
Yeah, a way to navigate the information overload around this issue. Maybe look beyond the surface headlines and ask what might be driving the narratives we hear.
Exactly, to question the underlying agendas.
Which brings us to our final thought for you. Considering everything we've discussed, the apparent inaction at the state level, this intriguing, maybe concerning, potential for AI governance, and the subtle ways narratives get shaped.
What responsibility do we have as individuals? How do we find the truth, or at least strive for it, and demand real accountability in such a complex, often manipulated landscape?
Something to definitely mull over.